This is about an elephant, electrocuted 100 years ago. Her name was Topsy, and she was famous at a time when people were still amazed by an elephant. Plus, she did tricks. She was a star attraction at Coney Island, and because of her fame, she had her own trainer, a man named Gus, who fed her, bathed her, cleaned her stall, and naturally a bond was formed between them. Love, you could call it. Gus knew that love was essential in the training of animals, and so he encouraged that love. He gave her bananas when she was good as a way to reinforce their affection. He also had a stick, but because for Topsy the connection they had was paramount, she loved him for the bananas and forgave him for the stick. When she got older and her novelty wore off, Gus drifted away. Other, more important animals required his attention, so that by 1900 she was mainly used for heavy labor. He hadn't exactly rejected her, but he didn't bathe her, he didn't comfort her, and he certainly didn't return her love. That was what she wanted. That was what she was used to. When a person gets used to a thing, and then that thing is taken away, the person becomes destabilized, and in that state, it's not too hard to go a little crazy. Topsy didn't go crazy, but she was hurt and she was sad. She was frustrated by her inability to affect her environment, and so she became more difficult to work with. Elephants remember so well because their experiences are stored in their bodies, and they have big bodies, and her big body was filled with unpleasant thoughts and emotions. She tried to banish these thoughts and emotions, but she couldn't. She couldn't deny them or ignore them because she was filled with them, literally. One day after work, two of Gus's friends stopped by. They'd been drinking and they were playing around, teasing Topsy, and one of them, as a joke, threw a lighted cigarette into her mouth. Because of the structure of the elephant mouth, she couldn't spit it out. It continued to burn like a fuse until suddenly something exploded in her. From her face alone, you wouldn't know. She looked calm and peaceful. From her big, sleepy eyes, you wouldn't sense the rage, and when she turned, she wasn't aware of any particular desire to kill. She wasn't actually conscious of hating the two men, but she grabbed the man with her trunk, lifted him up, threw him against the post, and there was nothing except the sound of the snapping of bones. A scream, maybe, because Gus, who'd been outside, came into the tent. The other man, the one who threw the cigarette, was on the ground underneath her foot, and partly out of anger and partly out of her desire to communicate her unhappiness to Gus, she raised her foot over the man's face, and then she let her foot come down. First, the man screamed, and then his head collapsed, mixing in with the hay and the dung. Gus, over by the tent flap, was just watching, silhouetted against the light. The first man, still alive, limped away to the edge of the tent, and it wasn't just the cigarette. Topsy knew that. She watched Gus with her large eyes, and she wanted Gus to know what she was feeling. There was no recognition on his face, but she was hoping. Even as she was surrounded by men with sharp poles, she watched Gus to see if he knew what he'd caused. As she was led away in chains, she kept looking back to see if now, finally, he understood. The day Topsy died was cold. Electricity was a novelty, and movies were a novelty, but death was the main attraction. Topsy had been tied with chains and ropes, not because she was a man-killer, but because man-killers made publicity, and publicity drew crowds. Luna Park was still under construction, and so an area was cleared where Topsy was going to die. And she knew she was going to die. That's why she didn't cooperate during the slow procession through the mud. They wanted Gus to help, but he wouldn't do it. Even when they offered him $25, he still refused. But he watched when they led her onto the makeshift stage. Her feet were guided onto thin wooden slippers, and then they attached the electrodes. Topsy was facing the crowd, looking at them, and of course she was thinking of Gus. She was tired of trying to be free of Gus and the habit of Gus, and now she'd given up. It was too much trouble. If there was ever a time she needed comfort, or what passed for comfort, this was it. That's why she was scanning the crowd to find his face, that familiar thing she was counting on to take her away from where she was. She saw women and children eating candy and men in caps, but not Gus. She kept looking for Gus, worried now and desperate. No more struggling for a happiness that seemed to be always eluding her. She wasn't interested in happiness anymore. She just wanted Gus. If she'd had a voice, she would have called out. And then she saw him. She looked into his face and she waited for something to happen. She didn't care what it was. Comfort, disappointment, it didn't matter. She wanted from Gus what she'd always wanted, a connection. And she stood there, waiting, but it wasn't happening. She could feel the cold metal digging into her skin. And his eyes, they weren't exactly vacant, but they weren't doing anything. She kept looking at them, hoping something would happen, expecting it to happen. And when it didn't, she looked at the other people, at the men and women, and they all looked the same to her. They all looked human. In their own eyes, they might have seen 1,000 subtle differences, but to Topsy, they were indistinguishable. She was looking at them, and then beyond them, over their heads, to the ocean. She could see the waves forming and reforming in lines along the water. She was looking at the waves in the cold, calm sea. And then the current entered her body. The sea got darker, and she opened her eyes and reached out, watching the waves fade, one after the other, until finally they disappeared completely. There was a silent film made of Topsy's death. The camera was there at the new Luna Park on January 4th. The difference between the film version and actually being there is that in the film, when the elephant falls to the ground, there's silence. In 1903, at Luna Park, the earth momentarily rumbled.